Okay, so here is the quadratic formula. So up until now, we have been factoring quadratics using the ABC method and solving them by then setting them equal to 0. So for example, the problem that's right here, you might say, A is 1, B is 2, and C is -8. We would do A times C, and that'd be -8. And then B would be 2. You'd find what multiplies to be -8 and adds to be 2. And you might go, well, it's 4 and -2. Right? 4 times -2 is -8. 4 plus -2 is 2. And then you would, you could do your shortcut because your A is 1. And that would be your dead cartoon eyes, so the parentheses with the x's in them. You'd bring down your factors. And then to solve, okay, because we got this here, we got this equal to 0 here, we would then set these equal to 0 and get x equals -4 and x equals 2. Right? And there was no problems there. It says how many answers did you get? Well, you always got 2 answers. Now, the only time you got more or less is if it was x cubed, you end up getting 3 answers. And then sometimes your answers might have been the same number. But you should, with a quadratic, you should always get 2 answers. So that was what we did before. So the question is, well, what happens, are there any problems where you can't factor? It seems that all the problems we've done, we've been able to find things that multiply to be this and add to be this every time. Well, are there situations where there aren't any combinations of numbers that multiply to be this and add to be this? And so that brings us to the next topic here. So how about this one? How about 2x squared plus 5x minus 8? Now, I apologize, the copy thing got messed up here. So I'm going to just go over here to the side, and we're going to deal with this 2x squared plus 5x minus 8. Now, typically we would do A is 2, B is 5, and C is -8. A times C is -16, and B is 5. So now our task is to find what multiplies to be -16 and adds to be 5. There's a problem here. Okay, I can give you all the time in the world to figure this out, and you're going to find that there is no two numbers that when you no two whole numbers that when you multiply them are -16 and add to be 5. You can go ahead if you want to pause the video and try. You're more than welcome to, but I'll tell you right now, there are no numbers. So what do we do? What do we do with this problem? We have to solve this problem, but we can't, there's no factors, and so we can't factor it. And that's where the quadratic formula comes in. The quadratic formula works for every single quadratic, even the ones that you can factor. So the quadratic formula is a way of solving factors that are not factorable. But you could use it for every problem, even the ones that are factorable. So the quadratic formula is this right here. And it's kind of hard to see, so I'll outline it for you. But it's x equals, now it says -b. I like to say the opposite of b. So it's opposite of b, plus or minus, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. The square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Seems super complicated, right? But it's actually pretty easy, and most of the work can be done in your calculator. So if you don't have a calculator, I would get one right now. Okay. It turns out that the A, B, and C that are in this quadratic formula here are the same A, B, and C that we've been finding before. So the A, B's, and C's are nothing new. It's the same thing. So we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve this problem by simply just plugging in the values for A, B, and C. Okay, so let's scroll down to the second page. We're going to skip all this. We'll come back to that later. Maybe. We'll see. So we're going to go down to the next, and you'll see here, here's the equation we were working with. Okay, 2x squared plus 5x minus 8. So again, this is our A, so A is 2, B is 5, and C is negative 8. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to the quadratic formula, and we're going to plug those values in. Okay, so let's make this a little bit thicker. Okay, so I have x equals, now, opposite of b. Now, keep in mind, one thing I want to just tell you is this formula, this quadratic formula, you're never ever going to have to memorize it. Okay, it'll always be given to you. It'll be on the board. It'll be on your paper. Okay, so you're not going to have to memorize it, but all you need to know is how to use it, how to plug things in properly. So the first thing is opposite of b. And that's really hard to see, but that is a b. So what is this? So opposite of b. So whatever b is, you just make it opposite. So in our case, b is 5, so the opposite of b would be negative 5. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. So whatever b is, just square it. So 5 squared would be 25. Minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 8. And all of that is going to be, and that's negative 8, all that's going to be over 2 times a. Well, since a is 2, 2 times 2 is 4. So that really, honestly, that is the hardest part right there, is just plugging it in properly. Okay. The rest of this stuff, depending on the type of calculator that you have, you can do most of this work in a calculator. Fancy calculators can do this entire problem from here just by plugging it in, as long as you plug it in exactly as it's written. Now, for those of us who, the 90% of us that don't have fancy calculators, here's what you're going to do. The first thing that you're going to want to deal with is this stuff that is underneath the radical. Okay? Don't worry about everything else. Don't even worry about the square root. All you're doing is the stuff that's underneath the radical. So we're going to simplify that first. So you have x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root. Now we're going to actually calculate what's in there. So what you do is you calculate this part right here. Okay, the 4 times 2 times negative 8. Now, here's the trick. You want to count all your negatives. Okay, negative, negative. 2 negatives, as we understand in multiplication, 2 negatives make a positive. So whatever you're going to do here, it's going to be adding these two. So I have 25 plus, because I know it's going to be adding because I have 2 negatives, 4 times 2, and they all change to positive. So this changes to a positive, this changes to a positive. 4 times 2 times 8. Well, 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 8 is 64. So it's 25 plus 64. The 2 negatives make a positive. It doesn't matter. Okay, the 2 negatives make positive, so both of these become positive. If there was only 1 negative, then it would be subtraction. But since there's 2 negatives, we have addition. We can simplify this even further. Now that's over 4. We can simplify this even further to be negative 5 plus or minus 25 plus 64 is 89. So the square root of 89 over 4. Now here's where it can get a little tricky. Okay, if you haven't noticed already, there's this funny little thing here called plus or minus. What the heck is plus or minus? Mr. G, there's no button on my calculator that says plus or minus, and there won't be a button on your calculator. So what you're going to have to do, because it means plus or minus, you're actually going to have to calculate the problem twice. One that includes a plus sign, and one that includes a minus sign. So what I do is I split it off here, and I do negative 5 plus the square root of 89 over 4, and then negative 5 minus the square root of 89 over 4. So you're actually going to get 2 answers. Okay, and here from here on out you can actually calculate this using your calculator. The square root of 89 is 9 point something here. I'll see if I can get a calculator. You're absolutely going to need a calculator for all this stuff here. So I can do in the calculator negative 5 plus the square root of 89. And then I'm going to hit equals before dividing by 4. So you hit equals and then divide by 4. It's a very important step there that you calculate this. So negative 5 plus square root of 89. Hit the equal sign in your calculator, then hit the divided by 4. If you did it right, you should get 1.1 for your first answer. The second one is negative 5 minus the square root of 89. Hit the equal sign, then divide by 4 equals negative 3.6. And that's my 2 answers. You notice that they're decimals. The reason why we use the quadratic formula is because you're going to get decimals. So that's why it's not factorable. So that's the quadratic formula. So we'll do one more problem here, and then I'll have you do one on your own, checking your answer. So that's that. So again, to recap, you're going to find your A, B, and C, just like before. Use the quadratic formula to plug in your numbers. Opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of B squared, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. You then simplify we call this the discriminant. It's not really important that you know that it's a discriminant, but this is what we need to solve first. We need to figure out what's under this radical. So this ended up being 25 plus 64, which is 89. Then we took the whole thing and actually calculated our answers. So let's try to do that again. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that in using the quadratic formula, now I have mentioned this before, but in using the quadratic formula, you can't solve a quadratic unless everything is on the same side of the equal sign. And I said that before. We cannot, it doesn't matter what way you're solving this, we cannot solve a quadratic unless everything is on the same side, which means that this negative 5x is going to need to go over there. Now, it doesn't combine with anything because there are no other x's. There's x squareds and there's a 1, but there's no x's. So by moving this over, it's simply going to add itself over here and put itself right in between there because it's our b. So what this now looks like is, and I'll write it up here, is 3x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals 0. All I did was just move that over and put it in its spot. Because it is the b, I put it in the b spot. Important step that you do that. Otherwise, you're going to think that b is negative 5. And when you plug negative 5 into here, you're going to get a completely different answer. So we want to make sure that we move that over here and it changes to a positive. So again, let's look at our quadratic formula. So first thing we need to do is identify A, B, and C. Okay, and it doesn't matter where you write this, but A equals 3, B equals 5, and C equals 1. Okay, so let's look at the answer here. So we get, so we're going to do this, x equals opposite of b, so negative b or opposite of b, so that's going to be negative 5, okay, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 5 squared is 25, minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is 1. Okay? All over 2 times a. Well, since a is 3, 2 times 3 is 6. Again, the first thing that you're going to want to do is figure out what is in here. Now in this case we only have one minus sign. There is only one minus sign. It's right there. So this is going to be minus. Okay, so when we write this out, okay, x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root, it's going to be 25 minus whatever, 4 times 3 times 1 is. 4 times 3 is 12, times 1 is 12, so it's 25 minus 12. All over our 6. Now we can simplify that just a little bit further by combining those. Oops, did not. Going all over the place here. Okay, so we get x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root. 25 minus 12 is 13 all over 6. Now we get to split it. Okay, now we're done. Now we get to the bottom here, and we have to do our plus and our minus. So again, we need to do negative 5 plus. We need to do the equation with a plus sign over 6, and negative 5 and 1 with a minus sign over 6. Okay. And then we use our handy dandy calculator to do the rest. Negative 5 plus the square root of 13. Remember to hit the equal sign after doing that. Then divide by your 6. So my first answer is negative 0.23. My second answer, negative 5 minus the square root of 13 divided by 6 equals, and my next answer is negative 1.43. Okay. So that is how we use the quadratic formula. Don't worry if you're still confused. We're going to get a lot more practice with this. I'm telling you. Generally, people actually think the quadratic formula is easier than any other method. Because the quadratic formula works for every single quadratic, students tend to use the quadratic formula more than any other way of solving these. So, the only thing I'm going to give you on this last one is just how to set it up, but I'm going to have you do the quadratic formula from there on out. So remember that I said that this has to be equal to 0, right? Or this, you have to have everything on the same side. So this 8 is going to need to go over here. Now it's not going to combine with anything because it's an 8, and over there is an x squared. So it's just going to subtract itself over to this side. So what this looks like now is 3x squared minus 8 equals 0. Now you're going to find that you're missing something. Okay, just like we did this in the factoring, sometimes you're going to be missing something. And it turns out here A is 3 and B, since it's missing, is actually 0. The C is negative 8. Now we can still do this even though the B is 0. So using our quadratic formula, x equals opposite of B plus or minus the square root B squared minus 4 AC all over 2A. We're going to plug things in. So x equals, now opposite of B, well there is no B, it's 0. So I actually don't need to put that. I can go right to the plus or minus the square root B squared. Well, there's no B, so I don't have to put that. I automatically go to the minus 4 times A times C. All over 2 times A, since A is 3, 2 times 3 is 6. So it's okay if things are missing, they're just not there. I mean, you could put a 0 there if you want to, but it doesn't do anything. So now we're going to simplify this part right here. Now this is a little bit easier because there's only really one step. X equals plus or minus the square root. Negative 4 times 3 times negative 8. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Negative 12 times negative 8 is positive 96 over 6. Now, I'm already done. All I need to do now is split this up. I need a positive square root of 96 over 6, and a negative square root of 96 over 6. Okay. Calculator, positive square root of 96 equals, don't forget to do the equals, otherwise you're going to mess yourself up, then divide by the 6, and I get 1.63 for the first one. Negative square root of 96 equals, divide by 6, equals negative 1.63. And that's how you use the quadratic formula. There is a practice, so make sure you look on Canvas. The practice, I believe, is in IXL, so check out those problems, check out on Canvas and see what the practice is to see if you actually know what you're doing. You might want to write down the quadratic formula somewhere so that you have it, because it will not be on the board during the test. So if you have any questions, let me know.